Our first story comes from a man named Nguyen Dai Hung, who took a job as a night shift security guard for a small office building in District 3 of Ho Chi Minh City. The work was straightforward enough. His responsibilities were to make his rounds, checking each floor, keeping an eye on the security cameras, and logging any unusual activity in the nightly report. For months, the nights were quiet and uneventful, blending one into the next. But that all changed during a particularly stormy night in July. As rain lashed against the windows and lightning intermittently lit up the sky, the hallway lights on the upper floors began to flicker. Aking was in the security room, scrolling through the camera feeds, when something on the 7th floor monitor caught his eye. The large mirror at the end of the hallway reflected a man standing directly behind his own desk chair in the security room. He froze, his blood running cold. He knew he was completely alone, yet the camera feed was undeniable. The mirror on the 7th floor showed someone standing right behind him. Mustering his courage, he took the elevator up to the 7th floor to investigate. When the doors opened, the hallway was silent and empty. He walked cautiously toward the mirror, his own reflection the only one he could see. But as he got closer, the image in the mirror shifted. It still showed him, but standing right behind his reflection was a tall man in a soaked white shirt, his head lowered so his face was obscured by shadow. Hung felt a sudden, unnatural cold creep over his skin, even though the building's air conditioning had been turned off to conserve power. He spun around, expecting to confront the figure. There was nothing. The hallway was completely empty. Then he heard the sound of footsteps echoing from the far end of the hall. They were slow, heavy, dragging steps, as if someone was trudging through water. He didn't wait to find out who or what was making the noise. Sprinted back to the elevator and returned to the relative safety of the security room. His heart was pounding in his chest as he looked back at the 7th floor monitor. On the screen, the same man in the white shirt was now walking slowly, deliberately, toward the elevator he had just left. Aching watched, horrified, as the figure reached the elevator doors and simply stood there. The elevator call button never lit up, and the doors never opened. The man just waited. Later, after mentioning the incident to a day shift colleague, Ching learned the building's dark secret a year prior, during another violent storm. A male employee who worked on the 7th floor had taken his own life by jumping from one of the windows. Ever since Hines' encounter, the security guards have noticed something strange. Whenever it rains, the mirror in the 7th floor hallway fogs over, and through the condensation, the faint silhouette of a man in a white shirt appears, standing perfectly still, staring directly into the Next, we have a story from Pham Nhat Tung, who lived in the city of Haiphong. His home was located near a set of old train tracks, and because he worked late shifts, he often found himself returning home on his motorbike between 1 and 2 in the morning. The road that ran alongside the tracks was always desolate and dark at that hour, with only a single flickering yellow street lamp casting long, dancing shadows across the pavement. It was on one of these late-night rides that he had an experience he would never forget. As he approached the dim glow of the street lamp, he saw the figure of a young woman standing dangerously close to the rails. She was wearing a long white dress, and her long dark hair was hanging forward, completely covering her face. Tianji's first thought was that she was either intoxicated or in some kind of distress. He slowed his motorbike to a stop a short distance away and called out, his voice cutting through the quiet night. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned she might wander onto the tracks. There was no response. The woman didn't move a muscle. She just stood there, a silent, still figure in the gloom. Tianji was about to call out again when she slowly raised her arm, her finger pointing stiffly toward the empty tracks ahead. Confused, he followed her gesture, looking down the dark, vacant railway line. He saw nothing. It was just an empty stretch of metal and gravel. When he turned back, his breath caught in his throat. The woman was no longer by the tracks. She was now standing inches away from him, so close that her hair was almost touching his shoulders. He felt an icy breath brush against his face, a cold so intense it felt like it was seeping into his bones. He instinctively stumbled backward, his motorbike wobbling beneath him. In that split second, she vanished. One moment she was there, a terrifyingly close presence, and the next, she was gone. The air was still and silent once more. Just as he was trying to process what had happened, he heard the distant horn of an approaching train. The sound grew louder and louder until the train roared past him, a blur of metal and flashing lights. As it thundered by, Tung's eyes were drawn to the carriages. There, standing on the roof of the third carriage, was the same woman in the white dress. Her head was bowed, and she seemed to be looking directly down at him as she was carried away into the darkness. The next morning, still shaken, he mentioned what he had seen to some of the local elders. One of them nodded grimly and told him, "A young girl died there years ago, hit by a train. They say she's been standing there ever since, still waiting to go home." Story 3. Tran Bovi. Our third account was sent in by Tran Bovi, who was a young nurse working at a provincial hospital. One night her shift was particularly hectic, running late until 2 in the morning. With the wards busier than usual, the staff had run low on clean linens. Vi was tasked with going down to the hospital's basement storage room to retrieve extra blankets. This storage room was a vast, cavernous space, rarely visited by staff, especially at night. It was filled with towering shelves of supplies, creating a maze of narrow aisles. As she entered, the motion sensor lights flickered on one by one, casting a harsh, sterile glow that didn't quite reach the deeper corners of the room. While she was searching through a stack of blankets, she heard a faint sound. It was a low groan, like someone in immense pain, trying to call out for help but lacking the strength. Vi paused, listening intently. I hear you," she called out, her voice echoing in the large room. "Who's in here?" There was no answer, only another groan, this time louder and seemingly closer than before. Vi's initial thought was that a disoriented patient might have wandered down there and gotten lost or injured. It wouldn't be the first time something like that had happened. Worried, she switched on her phone's flashlight and began to walk deeper into the rows of metal cabinets. Following the unsettling sound, the groaning grew more frequent, guiding her toward the back of the storage room. As she rounded a tall shelf, her flashlight beam fell upon a figure. It was an elderly man in a standard-issue hospital gown, but he wasn't standing. He was hanging suspended in the air, several centimeters above the floor, his feet dangling limply. His face was a horrifying bluish color and appeared swollen, his eyes wide and vacant. Vi let out a blood-curdling scream and scrambled out of the storage room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ran to find a doctor, frantically explaining what she had seen. The doctor, accompanied by a security guard, went with her back to the basement. But when they arrived and turned on all the lights, the storage room was empty. The man was gone. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. Later that morning, as her shift was ending, a senior doctor who had been at the hospital for decades pulled her aside. He spoke in a low, quiet voice. "That patient you described," he said, "he passed away last week. He's still in the morgue on the other side of the basement. You shouldn't go down there alone at night." Story 4. Levan Hao. We go to Da Nang, with an experience submitted by a taxi driver named Levan Hao. He had been driving a cab for years and was used to the strange encounters that come with working the late shift. But one rainy night, he experienced something that defied all logical explanation. He was driving near the iconic Thuhan Phuoc Bridge when he saw a young woman standing by the side of the road, soaked by the downpour. He pulled over, and she quickly got into the back seat without saying a word. Throughout the start of the journey, she kept her head lowered, her hair hiding her face. The ride was silent, except for the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the car's roof. As Hall drove down a particularly dark and isolated stretch of road, he glanced at his rearview mirror to check on his quiet passenger. His stomach lurched. In the mirror's reflection, the woman had no face. Where her features should have been, there was only a blurry, indistinct shadow. Panicked, he quickly turned his head to look at her directly in the back seat. She looked perfectly normal. Her face was pale and her expression was blank, but she was just a young woman sitting in his taxi. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, a strange reflection caused by the rain on the windows. He tried to shake off the unnerving feeling and continued driving toward the destination she had given him. As they got closer, he couldn't resist the urge to check the mirror one last time. He glanced up and his blood turned to ice. The back seat was empty. His passenger was gone. He was about to slam on the brakes, his mind racing to figure out how she could have possibly left the moving car, when a woman's voice whispered directly beside his ear, "Are we there yet?" The voice was soft ethereal, and so close he felt a cold breath on his neck. House slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt. The car skidded to a halt in the middle of the empty road. He whipped his head around, his eyes darting frantically around the interior of the cab. He was completely alone. He threw the door open and looked outside, but there was no one there. The only things surrounding him were the pouring rain and the oppressive darkness. But as he stood there, shivering in the cold night, he noticed a strange smell. It was the distinct cloying scent of cold incense, the kind used in funerals, lingering in the rain-soaked air before fading away into the night.
Story 5. Hong. A man named Nguyen Hong, who found that even the most familiar voice can become a source of unimaginable dread. Hong was a 24-year-old man living alone in a small wooden rental house on the outskirts of Bournemouth. His home was nestled near a vast rubber forest, an isolated area known for its frequent power outages that would plunge the entire landscape into an unnerving pitch-black silence. One night, at precisely 3 a.m., he was jolted awake by a sound. It was a soft but steady knocking at his front door. Knock, knock. At first, he dismissed it. It was probably just a stray cat or perhaps a drunk local who had lost their way. He tried to go back to sleep, but then the sound started again, this time at the window. It wasn't a hard rap, but a gentle tapping, as if someone were patiently drumming their fingertips against the glass pane. Knock, knock, knock. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Annoyed but now slightly spooked, Hong crept to the front door and peered through the small gap between the frame and the door itself. There was no one there. The small patch of dirt in front of his house was empty. He felt a moment of relief, thinking his mind was just playing tricks on him in the dead of night. But then, the knocking suddenly shifted. It was now coming from the back of the house, quicker and more insistent. Before he could process the impossible speed of the movement, a woman's voice whispered through the thin wooden wall. It was a low, cold, and mournful sound that seemed to cut right through the air. "Open the door. I'm freezing." Hong froze, his blood turning to ice. He had no neighbors nearby. The closest house was a good 300 meters away through the dense trees. No one should be out here. But what terrified him to his very core wasn't just the voice, but who it sounded like. It was the exact voice of his girlfriend Vi, who had tragically died in a traffic accident just 10 days earlier. His heart hammered against his ribs as he whispered her name into the darkness of his room. "Vi, is that you?" A soft, chilling giggle answered him from the other side of the wall. "Open the door, please." He didn't move. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put. He scrambled away from the wall and huddled on the floor, his back pressed against the opposite side of the small room, trembling uncontrollably. For what felt like an eternity, the knocking and tapping circled the house. It moved from the back door to the side windows, then to the front door again. He then heard it on the roof above him, and most horrifyingly, he began to hear faint scratching sounds from beneath the wooden floorboards, as if something was trying to claw its way in from below. Then, as suddenly as it had all started, there was silence. An absolute, deafening silence that was almost as terrifying as the noise it replaced. Hong remained there, paralyzed by fear, until the first faint rays of sunrise began to filter through the windows. With the safety of daylight, he cautiously unbolted the door and stepped outside. The ground was still damp from the morning dew. He saw footprints in the dirt leading up to his house, but they were horrifically wrong. The prints had no toes. They were just smooth, elongated impressions in the soil, as if someone with no feet had been dragged across the ground. Nguyen Hong packed his bags and moved out that same week, never looking back. Story 6. Our next story comes from a rideshare driver in Ho Chi Minh City who learned that some passengers are looking for a final ride home. Lahu Phat was 29 and worked as a rideshare driver to make ends meet, often taking the late-night shifts when the city was quieter. One evening, around 1 a.m., he was cruising for fares when a notification popped up on his app. The pickup location was odd. It wasn't an address, but a pin dropped right in the middle of the old Bin Loi Bridge, a place notorious for suicides. The passenger's name was listed simply as Ms. L. Hesitant but needing the money, Phat accepted the ride and made his way to the bridge. As he slowed his motorbike, his headlights cut through the gloom and illuminated a solitary figure. It was a woman in a long white dress standing motionless by the railing. Her long dark hair hung down, completely obscuring her face. As he pulled up, she glided towards him and whispered a destination, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Can you take me to Ong Bu Hospital?" Phat nodded and she got on the seat behind him. As he pulled away, an unnerving feeling washed over him. The air behind him felt unnaturally cold, like an icy breeze was clinging to his back despite the humid night. The entire ride was spent in absolute silence, her presence a heavy weight behind him. He tried to make small talk once or twice but received no reply. When they finally arrived at the dimly lit entrance of the hospital, Phat stopped his bike and turned to tell her the fare. "We're here." But there was no one there. The back seat was empty. Phat stared in disbelief, his mind racing. He was certain he hadn't stopped, that she couldn't have possibly gotten off without him noticing. Then his eyes fell upon the seat. A large, dark, wet stain marked the exact spot where she had been sitting, the shape perfectly outlining a human form. It was as if she had just dissolved into water. A hospital security guard who had been watching from the gate walked over, his expression grim. He looked at Fat's pale face, then at the empty, wet seat. "You picked up a ghost, didn't you?" the guard said, his voice low. "A young girl named Elle jumped off that bridge years ago after a heartbreak. Your description of her, it matches exactly. You're not the first driver she's called." Fat quit driving the night shift immediately after that encounter. Story 7. This next story is about how a familiar path can suddenly lead to something terrifyingly unfamiliar. Hong Thivai was a 31-year-old teacher in Tai Nguyen, a region famous for its sprawling, beautiful tea hills. Her daily commute to the school involved a ride through these hills on a winding dirt road. One foggy winter afternoon, she was making her way home when she saw something strange in the distance. A man in a plain brown shirt was standing completely motionless in the middle of one of the hills, surrounded by tea plants. She thought it was just a worker taking a break, but as she rode closer, a sense of deep wrongness washed over her. She could now see him more clearly, and she realized why he seemed so odd. The man's face wasn't a face at all. It was a dark, featureless void, a pitch-black oval of nothingness, as if someone had taken a knife and carved out his entire facial structure. Panic seized her. Vi twisted the throttle of her motorbike and sped away, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't dare look back. She rounded a sharp corner in the path, putting the hill and the figure out of sight. But as she straightened out, her blood ran cold. The same figure in the brown shirt was now standing right beside the road, just a few meters ahead of her. He had moved hundreds of feet in seconds, yet she hadn't heard a single footstep or any sound of movement through the fog. That night, Vi developed a high fever and was plagued by a terrifying nightmare. She dreamt that she was in her bed, unable to move, while the faceless man stood silently in the corner of her bedroom, just watching her from the shadows. The next morning, her fever had broken, but she was still shaken. She mentioned the strange encounter to her elderly neighbor, who listened with a grave expression. "You took the shortcut through the hills again, didn't you?" the neighbor asked softly. "You must be careful on that path. A long time ago a man hanged himself from a tree on that very hill. They say his spirit still wanders there, forever searching for the face he lost to despair." Vi never took that road again. Story 8. Kwong. They say a new home is a new beginning, but for one student, it was the beginning of the end of his peace of mind. Pham Kwong was a first-year university student who had just moved to Hanoi to save money. He rented a small, cheap room in an old apartment building in the Hadong district. His room was number 7. On his very first night, as he was trying to fall asleep, he heard a noise from the hallway just outside his door. It was the distinct sound of a wooden chair being dragged slowly across the tiled floor. Screech. He sat up, listening. The sound stopped. Thinking it was just another tenant moving furniture, he opened his door to peek, but the hallway was empty and pitch dark. He shrugged it off and went back to bed. On the second night, he was awakened by a sharp cracking sound. He fumbled for the light switch and his eyes immediately went to the large mirror hanging on the wall. A thin crack ran diagonally across the glass, from the top left corner to the bottom right. As he looked closer, he saw what looked like the faint, ghostly imprint of fingers clawing desperately at the glass surface, centered right on the crack. On the third night, the haunting became personal. He woke up abruptly, feeling a cold spot in the room. A woman's voice was whispering directly into his ear, so close he could almost feel her breath. "Don't stay here. It hurts, it hurts." He shot up in bed and slammed on the lights, his heart racing. The room was empty. The voice was gone. He couldn't take it anymore. The next morning he went to find his landlady and told her he was moving out. When he mentioned the strange occurrences in room 7, the woman's face grew pale. "I was hoping it wouldn't happen again," she confessed, her voice trembling. "A few years ago a young girl took her own life in that room. You are the third tenant in a row who has left because of her." Kwong packed his belongings and moved out that very same day. Story 9. Our fifth story comes from a security guard in Da Nang who discovered that some things lost in the dark should never be found. Tran Kwok Tuan worked the night shift as a security guard at a large apartment complex. Part of his duty was to patrol the sprawling multi-level underground parking basement. One night, during his 2 a.m. rounds, he heard a strange sound echoing from a dark, seldom used corner of the basement. It was a choking, raspy noise, like someone struggling to breathe. Cautiously, Tuan approached, sweeping the beam of his powerful flashlight across the concrete pillars. The light landed on a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, huddled against a wall with his back toward him, his small shoulders trembling. "Hey kid, are you lost?" Tuan called out gently, thinking the boy had wandered away from his parents. "Are you okay?" The boy slowly turned around. Tuan's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by sheer horror. The boy's face had no eyes. Where his eyes should have been, there were only 2 deep, black, empty sockets. Before Tuan could even scream, the boy let out a horrific guttural shriek that echoed through the entire basement. "Give me back my eyes." At that exact moment, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently and then went out, plunging the entire basement into absolute darkness. Tuan was frozen in terror. He could hear frantic skittering footsteps circling him in the pitch black, getting closer and then farther away, coming from all directions at once. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting wildly through the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Just as suddenly, the main lights flickered back on. The footsteps stopped. The boy was gone. When Tuan reviewed the security camera footage with his supervisor later, his blood ran cold. The video clearly showed him walking into the corner, talking to empty space, and then panicking in the dark by himself. His predecessor later filled him in. Back in 2014, a little boy died in a tragic accident down here, the man said quietly. His eyes were crushed. They say his spirit still wanders the basement at night, looking for them. Tuan submitted his resignation the next morning. Story 10. Lamb. Our final story tonight is a chilling reminder to all drivers that on a lonely highway at night, you are never truly alone. Du Van Lam was a long-haul truck driver who was used to spending countless hours on the road. One night he was driving a late-night route along a notoriously dangerous stretch of Highway 1A in Than Ho Province. The road was dark and empty. Up ahead he saw the faint silhouette of a motorcycle driving in the same lane. What was strange was that the bike had no headlights or taillights on, making it a serious hazard. Lam honked his horn loudly to let the rider know he was about to pass. He sped up, but the motorcycle seemed to match his speed perfectly, staying just ahead of his truck. Annoyed, Lam honked again, flashing his high beams. Suddenly, the motorcycle swerved sharply off the highway and into an empty, overgrown lot by the side of the road. As the bike passed through the arc of his truck's headlights, Lam instinctively glanced over to get a look at the reckless driver. Du Van Lam honked and tried to pass the motorcycle, but it kept matching his speed perfectly, never letting him overtake. Feeling uneasy, Lam switched to high beams then froze. The rider had no head. The motorcycle drifted into a dark empty field, moving smoothly as if guided by nothing. The headless figure sat upright, unmoving until it slowly vanished into the shadows. Locals later told Lam a man had died there years ago, decapitated in a crash. Never followed that bike. They warned that Lam never drove that road at night again.